Welcome back, everybody, for the second session for today, Digital Trust Management. We have the honor to have selection today, Mr. Randy Pomerandy. He's the CEO and MD in Digital Trust Technologies Private Limited. A bit of information about this company, Digital Trust. Enables trust in the digital ecosystems of the governments and enterprises by leveraging the strengths of government-driven EID or digital ID initiatives. Digital trust enables the integration of trust identification, trust identification, trust in communications, and trusted transactions. Mr. Pomerandy, at the same time, is onboarded as governing council members of Telangana Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which was set up in partnership with Data Security Council of India. With no further ado, I will give the floor to you, sir, to start your presentation.
Thank you, Calliope. Thanks a lot for your kind words. And good afternoon to all my friends in Netherlands, and good evening to all our friends in India. Trust. The most talked about subject especially in the current pandemic situation, because the work culture and the work environments have been transformed from, let's say, the physical office environments to work from home. And in terms of business transactions, most of the business transactions started to happening online and digitally. Therefore, we actually have taken up a subject which is the most relevant and critical and apt for today's context, and I'm sure it's going to be relevant for the future. Our elder generations and my parents and our elders kept teaching us, saying that you trust but verify. I think in today's world, we are actually getting to reverse that. You verify and then trust. That's what is the transformation that is happening. And that's exactly the transformation that has to happen in the digital world. You verify before trusting. When you say trust in the physical world, we trust basically because the contracts that we sign in the physical world are covered under the legal framework. Therefore, we trust the contract signed in the physical world. Just in case there is a dispute, there is a recourse. There is a legal recourse for sorting out the dispute. Now, how should this happen in the digital world? That's the whole topic of digital trust. Trust has broadly three elements. One is the transparency, and the other one, which is the most important one, is legitimacy. And of course, the effectiveness, because anything which is not helping the business to grow is not going to be adapted. So the trust has to enable the economic growth and growth of the wealth of the organization. Then only the trust adoptions will happen. I thought we will have this session organized in this manner. First, we'll touch base on what is digital trust, what are various constituents of the digital trust or the trust in the digital world, so to say. And in terms of the trust management, can an enterprise be, will enterprise be self-sufficient in managing the digital trust, or should there be an ecosystem? And I believe the trust management needs to go with an ecosystem approach. we'll touch base on that a bit. And I'm a strong believer and advocate of a role of EID and digital ID in achieving the trust in the digital world, which means that the governments will have a major role to play in enabling trust in any country, whether it is an enterprise level or at the national level. I thought just instead of just going with general explanation and theory, I thought I will take a use case, potential use case, which I believe is a very impactful use case if governments can take it up. And believe me, many governments are thinking in this direction. And finally, I will want to leave the session with some thoughts on kind of a framework on how to deal with adapting the digital trust governance, the digital trust framework, combining multiple stakeholders. Before getting on to the trust, what is digital businesses? Digital businesses are those businesses which use the existing technologies in transforming their business models, revenue models, and the market growth. One of the most important things that is happening in digital businesses today is, instead of technology being the support player, it is now becoming a lead player. And this is not only applicable for the digital only brands, like for example, you have Ubers and Netflix and various digital only brands. It's also happening for the traditional players, and they are transforming their businesses into the digital businesses by adapting the existing technologies, by putting the customer at the center of their strategies. The common elements in the digital businesses are use existing technologies. For example, the usage of mobile as a last mile platform in today's businesses and the business world is a great accelerator. And the transformation of the business itself into the digital business by using the digital transformation technologies. And by combining these, they are looking at the newer business models, putting the customer experience and then customer convenience and the customer benefit at the center of their digital strategies. This is what is the transformation that is happening across the world. If you look at the technologies that people are leveraging, this is open public information. I have not created that. The two most important things in terms of the technology usage is that availability and affordability of digital technologies is an important thing. That is where the mobile, the location services, the social media, the cloud computing, they're all being leveraged in achieving the digital transformations. The other key elements are the big data, AI and ML based analytics for improving the customer engagement management, improving the adherence to the service levels that are committed, that are promised to the customers. So this is the digital transformation that is happening. Coming to the trust aspect of it. Why is this trust important for the acceleration of these digital transformations? Like I said, in the physical world, if there is any dispute, there is a legal framework to resolve that. Whereas in the digital world, if there is no mechanism to resolve the conflicts, it cannot be, the transactions cannot be trusted. The trust as a subject comes into the picture only when there is a dispute for sure. But at the same time, it helps in building a reputation, and the reputation leads to a wealth, and continued sustained adoption of the trust leads to recurring wealth. Therefore, the trust is an important element in growing and in succeeding in digital businesses. And this entire information, the source is IDC, and then they put the entire the trust framework into a similar to Maslow's needs theory. The risk management aspect is a fundamental to the trust, and then comes in the compliance and security. Privacy and the ethics and social responsibility are strategic in nature. Finally, the actualization stage is the trusted environment, or the trusted businesses, or the governments. The outcomes obviously are enabled, trust-enabled commerce, trusted ecosystems, trusted governance, and the impact that it creates on the organizations or the governments is a reputation, a high reputation, and recurring wealth if it is a commercial organization. It's trending, and then it is important. I mean, it's happening now. These are the predictions made by IDC. By 2023, 50% of the G2000 will name chief trust officer who orchestrates the entire the trust across functions, including security, finance, HR, and the production, sales, and everything. And most importantly, 40% of the Fortune 1000 companies will require their partners and vendors to meet the trust scores. Now, there's going to be a framework, so there's going to be the evaluation framework which are going to come up, wherein your enterprise is rated on the trust level that you have achieved internally. I'm a believer of, like I said, I'm a believer of ecosystem approach. So if you look at the trust ecosystem, the government has a major role, because in any business environment and in any the transactions environment, what is more important is, like I said, the assurance to the stakeholders that the cost of adapting the trust is minimal, and when there is a dispute, there is a way to resolve it. So this is where the government plays a very, very important role. So why is this an important role? When the digital businesses are, removing the physical boundaries, that means they are becoming extended enterprises, wherein the identity of the people who interact with the businesses, they are no longer within the enterprise, they are outside of the enterprise. So to deal with the outside stakeholders who are not the employees of enterprises, who will manage the identities and who will manage the verification of the identity processes. Definitely, it has to be the government which has to manage that. Therefore, looking at this, many governments across the regions in the world have realized that trust is not only a problem at the enterprise, but trust is also a problem at the national level. Hence, many countries, and over 150 countries in the world, they are getting into something called EID, electronic ID, or a digital ID initiatives, to ensure that there is a trust provided in the online or the digital world by way of onboarding and performing the KYC of the individuals who are interacting with the businesses or the governments, the way of authenticating the citizens, and to create the trust in the communications, the contracts, and the transactions that happen digitally. So government has a major role, and government also has one more role. It has to show a path by creating impactful use cases of adapting this trust in the government use cases itself. And then regulators who will put the regulatory framework in place and also empower the enforcement authorities to verify the transactions in case of a dispute. Of course, the service providers are the enterprises. They, as far as their risk management and the security architectures are concerned, they are internal to the organizations. And as far as the trust technologies and trust integration is concerned, they necessarily have to rely on the government-driven the trust services, because of the fact that internal identity and the trust management initiatives will not be of the outside world, which is the customers of the enterprise. Finally, the people who are the end beneficiaries. So the entire approach of managing the trust has to take this ecosystem as a. So what are the very sure these are all familiar technologies which all of us are aware of. Encryptions, symmetric and asymmetric encryption, uh, digital IDs, biometrics, digital signature, PKI, smart cards, crypto tokens. So basically, these are all the technologies which enable digital ID. One of my friends in the industry, of course, he's an industry colleague, he was saying that one most important thing in the digital world is to create in such a way that that process of creation has to have a forensic evidence that the digital twin is exactly the person who is in the real world. That mapping has to have the forensic evidence, because the wrongly done creation of a digital identity will lead to chaos in the digital world. Therefore, that one first time process of creating the digital twin has to have that forensic evidence in the digital world. That is where government plays a very, very important role. I'm sure all of us are aware of the frauds related to synthetic identities, right? Synthetic identities are creating a mess in financial world in various parts of the world. So therefore, the enabling technologies are these digital ID and electronic IDs and biometrics and those technologies. Let's say there's a country which has issued a digital ID. There's a country which is issued electronic ID. But unless it is integrated with the service providers infrastructure and digital ID has no use. However, the challenge ID and digital ID has to happen has varied technological environments in terms of operating systems, in terms of the programming languages, in terms of the identities, in terms of various devices that they use. How do we ensure that we various diversified platforms? If you look at the point-to-point integration approach, it's going to be a mess. How many point-to-point integrations an enterprise has to handle? There we worked on in one of the Middle Eastern created an integration middleware which enables the integration smooth in spite of enterprises having all these diversified technologies. This is what is an apt approach if you have to manage a smooth integration of the trust into the enterprises or the digital businesses. So basically, the integration needs to happen a unified middleware kind of a thing, which handles the diversification of the technologies and the diversification of the platforms and the diversification of the devices that one may be using, enterprises may be using. This alone is not just sufficient, but it also has to have a central verification service, the verification services. For let's say, for example, if some of you are aware of PKI, the public key infrastructure, which is a key element in the technology, digital trust technologies. Every time there is a transaction signed in the digital world, the validity of the digital certificates either needs to be done through real-time verification or through offline verification through something like CRL verifications. And like our Aadhaar, similar to Aadhaar, even some countries in the Middle East also, they have a centralized biometric verification and validation services. And these are important. The important use cases for such things are the onboarding and KYCs. And one of the very important things in verifying the transactions is the timestamp. You need to be sure that the transaction is not only conducted by so and so person, but you also need to have the time authenticity of the transaction. Therefore, timestamp is also an important, very important service. Together is an infrastructure that offers ready-to-consume services which businesses can leverage and adapt and enable trust in their businesses. Can this not be done by the enterprise themselves? Of course, they can do it, but then the economies or the cost of doing or getting into such an initiative, I'm afraid prohibitively it can be higher. Therefore, it only makes sense to leverage on the government driven trust services or government enabled trust services, which are legally covered and which are available and uh, easy to consume. European Union is leading from the front in such initiatives. For example, they have EIDAS interoperability regulation across the European Union countries, and most of the European countries have their digital ID and EID initiatives already up and running. And most of these countries are going with a public-private partnership by licensing some organizations to be trust service providers, TSPs. And if they are EIDAS compliant, the transactions that are happening between the people belonging to various different countries are legally valid in the respective countries as long as they are compliant with EIDAS regulations. Nations are eagerly looking forward to that. And we are definitely seeing some of those kinds of initiatives starting, for example, in Africa. Africa is moving towards standardizations, regional standardizations in terms of interoperability of both EIDs as well as digital IDs. And just to tell, this is one of the use cases where we have played a key role in enabling this kind of infrastructure and transformations. If you just zoom into electronic ID as or a digital ID as an ecosystem, this is how it looks like. There are service providers and application developers, device vendors, people, the trust service providers, electronic authority, or the digital identity authority. All these have a role to play, and all these have to be integrated into the entire system. And the middleware that we have, a middleware and the verification service that we have implemented or supporting in that country combines or integrates all these stakeholders. It has the offerings. For example, if EID application developers, if somebody wants to integrate EID functionalities, let's say, for example, KYC and authentication and digital signature into their business systems. And this middleware enables them and offers the SDKs and toolkits to integrate into their middlewares, their business systems. And if such EIDs have to be used, because this country has issued a smart card, a multi-purpose smart card as an EID, with including the digital certificate infrastructure embedded in the chip, including the biometric and the digital signature or digital certificate infrastructure embedded into the chip. So for you to read and verify the citizens, you need specially made EID devices. So the vendors who are manufacturers of the devices are part of this ecosystem, and they necessarily need to go through some kind of a certification of the devices so that they are allowed in the market and the devices work with the middleware. So this is one use case that unless government gets into this kind of massive verification infrastructure, the legally valid trust, the acceleration of adoption of the trust into the business world, or so to say, the digital trust, is going to have its own impediments and problems. But the countries themselves have realized that this is not just the enterprise level problem. It is a problem at large at the national level, and it has to be solved at the national level, and the necessary infrastructure has to be provided at the national level. I also said government has to be a good play a good consuming role. I thought one of the best use cases government could ever think of is, I'm sure all of us are aware of delegation, the power of attorney. We delegate our powers to someone to perform or to conduct transactions on our behalf. And that's called power of attorney. And then in the physical world, there is a specific process. And with the advent of EID and digital ID, and many countries adapting that kind of programs, automation of the power of attorney and making it digitally verifiable power of attorney becomes a reality. And we are working on some of these use cases. I thought I'd just share some of those. It's going to be a little more technical in nature in terms of the PKI. Just to tell you, the PKI is asymmetric cryptographic technique, which has a public key and private key technology. And private key is always the individuals, and the safety of the private key is of utmost importance for the entire PKI to work and enable trust. Let's look at the real world scenario. If somebody has to give a power of attorney to someone. There is a principal and there is an attorney. Principal signs power of attorney. Attorney is someone to whom the power of attorney is given by the principal, and then it has to be registered. The registrar will have to stamp it and then registers the document, and it's archived, and copies of the attorney are given to the principals. Now onwards, the power of attorney is valid, and then you go with a copy of the power of attorney, and you can perform transactions on behalf of the principal. The attorney can perform transactions on behalf of the principal. Now the biggest challenge here is, one, the process of getting manually is tedious and time consuming, and bigger risk and bigger problem is that when the principal decides to, and they cannot revoke the delegation instantaneously. So we looked at a model where the instantaneous verification, instantaneous revocations can be possible. These are the key factors: online delegation, there is security authentication, digital certificate infrastructure. We conceived a concept called online delegation authority. And legal framework wise, you need to have the Digital Signature Act, which many of the countries already have, and of course the Pki infrastructure. These are the key issues and key critical factors, critical elements if such a system has to work. The overall model that in terms of the stakeholders, there's the principals, attorney, relying parties, there's a CA, and if there are payments involved, there's a payment side, a multi-factor authentication, because like I said, when you are onboarded onto any transaction or any organization, verifying the identity of the individual, which is legally valid, is an important. So multi-factor authentication is an important element in the entire identity and access management framework. There's of course the timestamp and digital authority services. Let's look at some flows. Issuing the delegation certificate. Let's say there is a principal and there is an attorney. The principal's public key, attorney's public key, and both are signed by the principal private key. And now, once that is done, the power of attorney can be issued. Principal signs it. Principal includes the attorney's public key. Public keys are available for the public consumption, openly available as a directory service in the Pki infrastructure. And then the whole thing is signed by the principal's private key anyone. And then the attorney signing once the principal signs it, the principal's digital signature and attorney's public key is embedded into the power of attorney. Attorney signs it. So at this stage, with the attorney's public key, there is a principal's signature and there is attorney's signature associated with the power of attorney. The power of attorney is also a digital document, which probably is an XML, which gets digitally signed, and then that is stored centrally for the verification to the principal is delegating to the authority. And then you register that with the signed power of attorney, both by the principal as well as the attorney, can be submitted to the delegation.
Mr. Pomerandi, we are experiencing some connection difficulties.
Yes,
yeah, we're back.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm sorry for the connection. You know, the work from home, however much you want to control the usage of the Wi-Fi or the internet, sometimes
I can completely understand what you're saying.
Use it for emergency purposes. Yeah, okay. So the
Yeah.
timestamping is done and the submitted to the digital. Am I audible now? Okay, if you look at the transactions part of it, the attorney can sign the transaction with the private key. Now the relying party will pull the delegation certificate as well as the power of attorney, verifies, validate the certificates, computes the hash of that, and matches with the hash that is part of the transaction. And if both are matching, the transaction, the attorney is allowed to perform the transaction. Something like this is a path-breaking initiative that governments will have to show the path of implementing such things, because some of these things will really accelerate the usage of the digital trust in the businesses. In summary, from whatever we have looked at, in summary, the services that we have seen, the technologies that enable the trust, that are used for enabling the digital trust. But if you look at the services, or some various services are, so to say, products that are required to be integrated into your business or digital business infrastructure for enabling trust, is the legally compliant KYC or the onboarding. Of course, you will achieve that by digital ID or trust middleware, which is managed and hosted by the government. And of course, multi-factor authentication, because the authenticity of the individual is an important, authentication is an important element. Digital signature services. And of course, the biometric verification based on the level of assurance that is required for a given transaction. The biometric services also are an important pieces. Many countries are to enable the digital trust at the national level. Many countries are looking at adapting such national level infrastructure. And this is one of the initiatives in an African country that we are also associated with. Coming to the business enterprise level, if you want to look at how you are performing in terms of the trust, these are probably the steps that one could think of. User feedback is an important, because in the digital businesses, user experience is the most important thing. The customer engagement analytics is an important element. Accreditation and audits, self-assessment, monitoring and benchmarking of the trust levels or the trust levels the business is implemented, and you sign various levels of service level agreements with various stakeholders, be it your customers, be it your partners, be it with the government, in terms of compliances and various things. So you will have to look at the service level, to what level of adherence you are in terms of service level agreement. Finally, the reputation audit at the enterprise level. Finally, I want to leave the thought with the audience that for enabling digital trust implementation framework, on one side you have the government, regulators, enterprises, and the people. And if we have to conceive an idea where the entire implementation journey into multiple stages, like enabling the trust, enhancing, establishing, and expanding. What should government do at the enable stage? What should government do at the enhanced stage? What should government do at the established stage? And most importantly, each of these parameters are the factors or the initiatives that government or the regulators or the enterprises get into at various stages of the trust adoption. How do we measure them? How do we score them? How do we, what level of weightages that we have to assign? And finally, how do we rate the digital trust initiatives, either at the enterprise level or at the regulatory level or at the government level? It's something that one can think of, and some of the audience, some of the participants and some of the students can take this up as an exercise to get into this kind of defining this kind of a framework. This is going to be a slightly bigger initiative or larger initiative, because in each and every cell there will be multiple initiatives, and each of the initiatives effectiveness we need to have a measuring mechanism. So this is something that I want to leave it to the participants, and I'll be more than happy to participate with the students in working out these things together. We as an organization have started working on this kind of a framework wherein we will be able to measure the level of digital trust achieved in various at various stakeholders. We are taking inspiration from UN PAN eGov readiness index that UN publishes biannually, and they consider a lot of indices and a lot of factors to rate the countries on the eGov or the digital government's readiness. Taking inspiration from that, we will have to complete, or we will be completing this framework, and I'll be too happy to participate with any of the participants or any of the students who are interested. And maybe I think as a team, people may have to form a team, because it needs some kind of a legal expertise or legal side view, and it definitely takes some strategic view. It definitely takes some technology views. So it's a multidisciplinary team which can probably start working on this. So anybody who is interested probably can approach. Finally, I want to leave this discussion with the quotes from Jeffrey Ritter. I have not read this book fully, but then I really like these quotes. Every transaction creating wealth first requires an affirmative decision to trust. Building trust creates new wealth. Sustaining trust creates recurring wealth. Achieving trust superior to your competition achieves market dominance. I think the trust is going to become a growth factor, strategic factor, rather than a supporting factor. There's one more reason why risk management is failing. The managers and champions for this spending have never been able to connect the proposed investments to how their companies can create wealth. So in today's world, um, the wealth creation, anything that an enterprise does, it has to create wealth, which is probably beyond profits. So it has to create wealth. So with these quotes and with these thoughts, I want to leave the forum for the questions. I'm not sure whether how am I doing on the time side of it?
It is perfect, actually, and we have 15 minutes for questions, so hopefully we can address some more. And if you're ready, sir, I can start posing them.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. You referred to the framework before and to the regulators, and the participants want to know if who is a regulator? Is it just law enforcement agencies, for example, or other entities as well?
When I say the enforcement agencies are a part of, they are the lawmaking agencies. For example, in India, we have cyber laws. The agency which makes the cyber laws is the first. And enforcement agencies are many. So it could be police, it could be a legal system, the lawyers, the courts. How basically, like I said, verify and trust. So all these digital transactions have to be subjected to verification in case of a dispute, right? So that means on what basis you will verify and on what basis you will confirm that it is in line with the law of the land. There needs to be a law, and there needs to be a mechanism to enforce, and there need to be agencies who should enforce. When I say regulators, it's a common. Maybe I think I used the regulators as loosely, but I meant all these agencies.
Thank you. And I think it's really interesting what you said about the jurisdictional limits to an investigation. The next question is about social media companies like Facebook, where there was a leakage, for example, with Cambridge Analytica, that involved the transaction of personal data. How can digital trust be established there? And what is the role of governments in these kinds of issues?
Right. This is as bad as the trust in Facebooks and the social media is as bad as COVID-19 pandemic. Uncontrollable. Jurisdiction is going to be a major issue in this. So what we talked about is basically the a regional and a national level regulatory compliances. For example, EIDAS provides the interoperability standards, interoperability regulation across the European Union member states, right? But social networking initiatives like Facebook and all that, ID verification itself is a major mess. And the less we talk about fake identities on Facebook, the better it is. There is no one single mechanism to ensure the key to the trust in the digital world is to ensure that we create a digital twin, and such process of creating the digital twin has to have a forensic evidence which can be verified at any point in time. Forget about the Facebook itself. In the US, synthetic identities are playing havoc in financial world. They take SSN number of somebody, date of birth of somebody else, address of somebody else. Individually, they are all valid and correct. But combined, it doesn't point to any one real world human being. But they figured out a mechanism to make that synthetic ID valid in the digital world by exploiting the loopholes between various verification agencies. And then the frauds were to the tune of billions of dollars. So in the business world itself, the identity and the trust problem is yet to be resolved. We are not there. We are still not there. Many countries have started realizing this, and hence the governments are taking the initiatives to put in place the trust services and trust service providers framework. And European Union is taking the lead in this entire process.
Oh, that is interesting information indeed. Well, there are a couple of questions about blockchain, and I will just read them aloud. The first one is, what's the separation of duties between regulator and government? And do you see, well, I think there are different ones, but do you see the utility of blockchain as a repository of federated trust?
Certainly, yes, and the multiple many technologies which can enable the trust. One of the examples in UAE is something called UAE Pass. What it does is that it does a one-time verification of the digital and electronic ID of a citizen, and it creates a digital profile of an individual, and it pushes that into a blockchain. And for subsequent verifications, this profile is used as a legally valid onboarding profile. It is not a KYC mechanism, it is an onboarding profile. With that profile, one can onboard, one can do a self-onboarding so that businesses can act and recognize that as a valid onboarding process. So blockchain definitely has its usage. See, the problem in the trust verification is, it is highly time sensitive. It is highly time sensitive, and at that time of transaction, is everything valid? So by creating a profile in a blockchain, yes, the attribute services and the profile services can be enabled in a highly secured manner, no doubt about it. But what happens when that profile or that individual's ID is blocked after he created the profile in the blockchain? So it is not about just one technology, it's the entire end-to-end process which needs to be tight. There are many technologies, including the blockchain, which can be leveraged and which is highly effective and useful.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. There is an interest to know where the digital certificate is implemented and why is it maybe necessary, important?
Right. In the physical world, the way you sign a contract, there is a legal paper. In India, we call it as a stamp paper. And you sign an agreement on a stamp paper, and you register that in the with government, the registration authority. That's a legally valid contract in the physical world, and that is trusted in the court of law, and that is taken as a valid proof of a contract in the court of law. The problem with that is that with the innovative morphing technologies, that are digital morphing technologies that are available today, the fake documents are possible and feasible. Like I said, power of attorney also can be created as a fake document. In the digital world, the equivalent of the physical world signature and registration authority stamping, to the technology used for achieving a similar effect in the digital world is a PK called PKI, Public Key Infrastructure. The public key infrastructure works on something called key pair. One key is called private key, which is absolutely owned, and it is never shared with anybody else. It is with the individual alone. The other one is the public key, which is public domain information. So for in the digital world, the physical world like signature is a digital signature, and you need a public private key for you to digitally sign any document or a transaction or a contract. And the public key, which is part of the certificate, is used for verification of that signature. So you sign with the private key, that signature can be verified with the public key. So that is what is the concept of the digital signature and the public key infrastructure, and which is the most critical technology that enables trust in the digital.
Thank you so much. There is a more general question regarding the definition of digital trust. So, what do we mean by digital trust, and more specifically, how can we measure it? Is it measurable?
Yeah, that's a while it is a generic question, it's a very good question. If you look at the final the last but one slide that I had, we are in the process of defining a framework which can probably be able to help measure the trust levels. For example, in the identity scenarios, there is something called assurance levels. So even similar to that, we are looking at defining measures of the trust. Because the trust has multiple elements. Trust starts right from creating your digital identity. If it is done by the government, it is trusted. And if you are using it, your trust level goes up. And then how do you do the KYC? How do you authenticate the customers to get into to avail your services? And how do you protect the integrity of the transactions that are happening in your business, be it with the partners, be it with the customers? And finally, do you have a verifiable transaction repository which can be verified digitally? These are various broad level elements, but then how do you put measures around it? So that's what we are working on. I'm sure a lot of consulting companies, the big consulting companies must have already started working on it. As a smaller company, we also started working on it. Let's see how it goes.
Thank you. And maybe connected to what you just answered, let me ask you if the government is envisioned to be both the enabler and the regulator, then how can we achieve some checks and balances when it comes to digital trust?
Unfortunately, that's how the government is structured. Regulator is part and parcel of the government. There cannot be a private regulator. But I think even when the government creates this trust infrastructure, they will have to go through a regulatory clearance. There is no exception to that. They will have to get it certified by the regulation and prove that it is in line with the regulation requirements. All the services that are being offered by the government as a trust provider are in line with the regulatory guidelines and regulatory requirements. That certifications has to happen, though there are different entities within the same government.
Thank you, and maybe a couple of more questions before we close this up. There's a question to maybe explain a bit what is trust assurance levels and their measures. So elaborate a bit on this term.
Yeah. If you look at the various elements and ingredients of the trust that we said, there is a risk and compliance level, and there is security, there is a compliance level, and there is a privacy level, and there is so there are various elements. Each of these have their own measures, and each of these have their own frameworks for measuring them. And in my view, I could be wrong, but in my view, we will have, for every sector, for every business, the weightages assigned to all these elements will vary. So we will have to come up with some kind of, I would say, scoring protocol, wherein based on the sector, the customer segment, based on the risk levels, based on the specific customer needs, one would be able to define the criticalities and the weightages of various elements. And in that there could also be some mandatory, and then there are some flexible things. Like for example, every digital transaction has to be digitally signed. There is no way one can reduce the weightage to this. So there are certain fixed elements, and there are certain flexible elements wherein you can adjust the weightages. And so we are thinking this kind of a framework wherein we will be able to measure finally the trust level. It is like authentication assurance levels, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. Similar to that trust. I don't know. We will still we will figure out a nice terms or nice headings for those while figuring out the scoring protocols. We will simply not say level 1, level 2, level 3, but we will put some exciting headings.
Looking forward to that, for sure.
Yeah.
So maybe a last question, and this has to do with encryption. So if the keys for asymmetric encryption are obtained by the certification authority based on a single country, can the government, through a court order, force this authority to give up the private keys?
Right. There are multiple, there are two models in this. One is when the digital signature is happening, it can happen locally. Locally in the sense at the point of the transaction. Right. So for that, there's certain infrastructure required. The most important thing in this, like I said, is the safety of the private key. Now, if you are simply storing the private key in, let's say, the key store of your desktop, it may be vulnerable. That may not be really trusted. And that is, as per the IDCSS regulations, that is not valid. So as per IDCSS, there is something called a qualified signature. A qualified signature is something which is signed by a key pair, by a key which is generated in the device, not in the software, not in the servers or software. So the device can be a smart card. Device can be something called a hardware security model, HSM, what we call it. So in one model, the private key is burnt into a smart card, in which case the digital signing can happen locally, because let's say through a browser you are performing a transaction, and then it is asking you to insert the smart card wherein you have the private key, and then the transaction hash is sent to the smart card. The private key which is there in the smart card signs that internally within the smart card. It doesn't happen in the system, so that it is absolutely safe. And then it returns the signed envelope. So this is called client-based signing. But the flip side of this is you need to necessarily have to have a smart card or a crypto token or special devices like smart card readers and things like that. Alternatively, the key pairs are generated in the HSM, and public key will never come out of the HSM. It is stored against your identity profile within the HSM. Now, whenever you want to sign, you will go through an authentication mechanism, multi-factor authentication mechanism. Based on the level of trust required, level of security required, it can even be biometric-based authentication, which enables the HSM to perform the digital signature within the HSM on your behalf. Now, this is called server-based signing. In both the scenarios, the private key has to be sealed in the device. That's the model which is valid as per the legal term. If the private key is outside of a device, you are inviting for trouble.